Om Sahanavavatu Sahanau Bhunaktu Sahaviryam Karavavahai Tejasvinavaditam Mastuma Viddishavahai. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. May that one protect us both. May that one nourish us both. May our study be collectively useful. May our study give us energy and strength and illumination. May we not unnecessarily quarrel with each other. Peace, peace, peace be unto all. It is common to have some kind of paradox and some kind of friction between the things that we are taught and the principles that we're taught, the practical life that we live, and the basis of that we assume to be true and real for this moment in time. No matter how much philosophy tells us that there's a unity of existence, our very internal gut and instinct tells us something different. And so, how do we practice this in such a way that the principle becomes a reality to us? And the answer is that, generally speaking, we have to do it in a progressive way, using all the tools and resources at our disposal. Obviously, scripture is one of these resources, but we have to be truly understanding what we mean by scripture, because there are many scriptures that we rely on very heavily, but all these scriptures may well be subject to interpretation. These scriptures are only like manuals to say that somebody has constructed something, or somebody has been aware of something, or somebody knows something, just like a manual that we use to try and find out where something is in a car, what parts are there, what parts are required, and when it goes wrong, what to do. And so we have a manual that is based on a manufacturer's understanding of knowledge of how a car was manufactured, where the parts are, and how they can be conveyed to the user. And so when we talk about scripture, we really are talking about somebody who has knowledge, some experience that somebody has, some credible authority that says, I have been on this path, or I have seen this truth directly firsthand, and gives us the possibility to replicate it, given that there are step-by-step instructions to assist us in the process, and gently steering us away from the outside to the inside. Why from the outside to the inside? Because we cannot take for granted automatically that what we see with the eyes and hear with the ears, what we register with the bodily senses, is accurate and true. Certainly it is functional. Supposing I was to study quantum physics and somebody says, please construct a table, and I will say, but I need so many quarks to do it, and so many electrons to do it. And after all, when I analyze it fully and bring it to its most subtle fundamental level, I don't find anything solid at all. And our most basic physics will tell us this, a wonderful, wonderful discovery from very early on, the early 20th century, where we are told, actually now, when we try and get down to the fundamental building blocks, we come away from some fundamental raw elements to molecules, to atoms, but we find even the atoms have parts. And when we can't go any further, these are fundamental. And then we discover they're not segmented parts, as in a motor car, easily distinguished. There's a gap here, you put another part there. No, it's more like a vague field, something like a vacuum. And when we say it's a quantum vacuum, we're really saying that it is a vacuum with low density, and then something comes up from it. And normally in a kind of symmetry, a plus and minus, that annihilates itself and goes back. Something like a fizzy drink where we observe the bubbles come up and disappear, but things are not what they seem, because that's not how we see things. And if we saw things like this, we wouldn't be able to function in this world of tables and chairs. And asking a carpenter, please make a table, he'll want to know what quality of wood you want, what dimensions he should make it, how he should cut it, what size you want, height and depth and width. And then what style would you like me to make it in? This is the information required by a carpenter. So we have to be flexible enough to shift our position in any circumstance so that we see things both functionally and also in their subtle form. Why should we try to see things in their subtle form? Because when we try to answer the serious questions in life, what is the meaning of life? Who am I? What does it mean to be existent? What is life? When we try to answer these questions, the surface impressions that we have in our day-to-day life will not answer these questions. We will have to go deeper. Science itself went deeper. Science said that when we look into matter, we find energy. And then they had to look even deeper still. But when you look at the person, you're going even deeper. And when psychology is born, then it's now investigating the subtle area of the mind that is full of qualia, subjective experience. We cannot see an elephant that is created by the word elephant. We can't see it in the mind. If you say the brain is able to capture a picture when you say elephant and make an association like that, the head is definitely not big enough to fit a whole elephant in. And so there's an idea, these are subtle things, and these are unproven except to the one that experiences it. If you say you have an idea at this moment in time, I'm neither able to prove or disprove, I have to take your word for it. It is your own experience. I cannot try to estimate or verify what your personal psychological experiences are or what you're feeling, except for this fact that there's a concordance with my feeling. When you feel sad, I know what sadness feels like. When you say that you feel elated, I know what elation feels like. When you have a concept of beauty, see, there's a common human experience about it. And is this just random? Is this just the way we are? Or is something else going on? Is there a causal chain to which we can trace that leads us to deeper, more subtle areas that we don't normally experience? Everyone will admit that dream is a very subtle area. But if you say to me, I dreamt A, B, and C last night, I have no way of understanding it. Even if you relay what this dream was about and gave me all the details, I still haven't got the exact sight of it as you have. But I can simply say, yes, I know what dreaming is. And I know that we can have so many interesting objects. I know that I can be a king with a queen in a palace and live for 1,000 years. This is all possible. I know in a dream I can fly. So I won't relegate your dream to the rubbish heap of impossibilities. I will accept it. But this is in the realm of what we call the mind. Not only the mind, but a deep area of the unconscious mind. And what is the unconscious mind? What is the mind itself? And how do we know about all the activities that take place in there? So there is an expression that we can use in answer to a question. Because we know what splendor looks like. Everybody knows that the sun shines. and that the sun is something like a self-effulgent body. We don't investigate what in its very core happens so that the fusion that takes place and the radiation that takes place and the conversion from hydrogen to helium that takes place, that produces ultimately shining on the surface, and that has a difference in temperature and pressure that comes out over many, many thousands and millions and even billions of years and radiates out of the surface in the infrared. And then we warm our skin with it, and we're able to grow things by it and use the photoelectric effect of it in order to use the capacity of chlorophyll in plants and make a photosynthesis. And that's converted into carbohydrates that we munch and crunch on. And that gives us energy. There's a whole drama that is performed. Normally, we don't think of it or register it in this way. We take many things for granted because our functional life doesn't think of these things because there's no necessity to think of these things. We can live our life quite happily, not knowing the answers to all these questions and not even touching the discoveries of modern science that leads us into deeper material areas of this world. But the ancient seers, they looked into these questions. They went from the outside to the inside. And they started off with this question: I exist. What is that? What does it mean? Nobody can ever deny that they exist. It's a good starting point. So let us say I exist and take it from there. What else? And many religions, they use this understanding of an extra cosmic entity and they start from that point. And then they say, I'm here, and look around bewildered, where is God? And the materialist says, your God is nowhere, therefore doesn't exist. But you see, the stars shine in the daytime. We don't see them, says Sri Ramakrishna. That doesn't mean to say they don't exist. The fact that you cannot detect something doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Today, modern cosmology has come up with some astonishing ideas. One idea is that we only see about 4 to 5% of what is actually there. Our observable universe of matter, stars and luminous bodies and this earth and all the other things that we take for granted is only about 5% of the stuff. 70% is a kind of mysterious energy that is increasing and accelerating the expansion of space. And about 20, 25, 26% is a kind of mysterious matter that you can never see because it doesn't react with other baryonic matter. It is non-baryonic matter, and therefore untraceable. It only knows gravity. But these are just assumptions put in because we cannot see anything. And these are simply solutions to awkward problems that may well have different solutions other than these. So most of what, according to the modern cosmological models which are there today, most of the matter in the universe, most of what exists materially is subtle and untraceable, and we have no idea what it is. So in the ancient days, did they understand some of these things? And the answer is they had the capacity to concentrate. And sustained concentration in one direction is what we call meditation. Meditation, that is shining your capacity to be attentive. This faculty of attention, beaming it like a laser beam, will reveal the secrets of whatever you're concentrating on. This is what they discovered. And for this reason, we take it very seriously, the source of this truth that we label as Vedas. And particularly we're concerned with that aspect of the Vedas that are concerned with the most subtle area that is even beyond and behind the material universe. and that is untraceable as an object. But we have to also lead the mind in this direction, and all the Upanishads do it in their own way, understanding that subtle things require subtle arguments, subtle approaches that we need to rally around and close all our intrinsic experiences and how we feel about things, and close the gap between the principle and the practice and the experience of it. To close the gap between what we feel emotionally and instinctually and what is actually true. And the latest physics that occurred in the 20th century, now well over 100 years old, will tell us a story of subtlety that is not within the range of our so-called normal experience. If that is applicable, and if that is the foundation of our existence, and if it is against the grain of our perception, then we have to take it seriously that there's an increasing level of subtlety that we don't know of, that we have to be convinced of, and more that we can ourselves experience through this process of meditation. So the Katha Upanishad will give us many, many approaches and experiences of this. One particular passage will highlight the very subtlety of what we're talking about. But it's preceded by an order of subtlety, and we can't ignore that. So what is this order of subtlety? See, it begins with the very obvious field of our experience, and that is the field within our sense organs. And so these are various layers. That means when we look at a unit and find out how we can explore this, we can't see it as a whole thing. We have to see it in parts, very much like sheaths. We can understand that in Russia there are these Russian dolls where one small figure fits into another, fits into another, fits into another. So we can understand the concept of layers. And if we study anatomy and physiology, we can also understand, in order to study it, different layers, if you will. If you want to study man in physiological or anatomical terms, we can take man, muscular man. You can see a diagram in an anatomy book and see, okay, the muscular structure there. Because we don't have X-ray eyes to see through the skin and penetrate that and see what's going on at the muscular level, then we can have useful diagrams that says, this is muscular man, this is what it looks like. And we can see the various fibrous muscles within that figure, in the arms and the legs, and the chest, the back, and so on, and get a good understanding, but that's not the whole of man. We have to look a little further. Neurological man will explain the neurology system of nerves, the central nervous system, where the brain itself is attached to the central spinal cord, and we find branches going off and sub-branches in a very complex system, and all of them having electrical charge. If we want to understand the circulatory system, we have to do the same in that way and see the kind of metro system carrying goods around and depositing in different parts of the body, nourishing all the cells and taking away all the waste products. So there's man, the pneumatic system, there's man, the circulatory system, but when you combine all these, you have one entity. In this same way, we can look at this existent entity that we call I and find out what we are there, what is there, and see there's a world that we are living in, that we relate to, that is functional for us. But is there any benefit in us seeing it differently? So it starts off, Indriya Bhyaha Para He Atta. Beyond the senses are what? Are the objects. But you see there may be many more objects, and we can't simultaneously see everything. And then, beyond the senses are the objects of the senses. They're not objects outside the scope of the senses. We cannot see infrared, we cannot see ultraviolet, we cannot hear ultrasound or subsonic sound. We can't hear any of these things. And beyond the objects is what? Some observing and registering element that can see what is going on, something that acts as a kind of repository for information, and through a series of processes can react also. And so beyond these objects is what we call mind. So this is called Arthebhyai cha param manaha. And manasha cha para buddhi, beyond the mind is buddhi, the intellect. Beyond the mind is this understanding. When we see something and register it, we have to make some sense of it. And so we have to look at it carefully, compare it to other memories, and see if we can really comprehend it in order to react to it. But beyond the understanding is what we call the great self, Mahan Puraha. This Atma, Mahan, the great self, and Shankaracharya means by this the great soul of the entire universe. And so we can extrapolate what we find here to the entire cosmos on the basis that the law of nature must be constant. What I find here, I must find everywhere. But according to the Rig Veda, in the beginning was the chaos of what is described as fluidity of waters, floating on which appeared this golden seed, this creative aspect. We can register this in the language of golden germ or scene, Hiranyagarbha, the firstborn of creation, what we can call cosmic mind, and the creator of all other human beings. So Hiranyagarbha is the soul of the universe, if you will, the mind of the universe. We can imagine like this: if the highest product of the evolutionary process, not just biologically evolutionary, but the whole cosmos got together to make what we are now. It didn't begin with biological cells. Biological cells made from atoms, essentially the simplest of all atoms, the hydrogen atom. Where did hydrogen come from? Is a wonderful, wonderful question with no answers in any of the modern scientific cosmological models. The origin is a blank. We can say it came from the fireball, but where did the fireball come from? And they will say, essentially it came from nothing, meaning nothing that we can register, something that transcends our understanding. So this Hiranyagarbha is the soul of the universe, and we can imagine, therefore, the whole universe as one cosmic person with the same faculties as the highest expression of this evolutionary process, namely man. We can see now cosmic man, and the Purusha Suktam is one of those texts that illustrates this in poetic language beautifully, the concept of one cosmic person. And so when the golden light of this Purusha, this person, is cast on all the rich, the content of Prakriti, then we have these manifestations from crude matter, even to the divinities in paradise, and we accept the possibility of all these other subtle beings within this complex that our eyes cannot register. And it's no surprise today, because we cannot register ether. We cannot register photons, except when they hit the eye. We cannot register dark matter, we cannot register dark energy, and we cannot see the activity going on in the atom. We can see the effects of it. We can maybe see Brownian motion, We can maybe test these things as data blips, but to see it directly is far too small, far too subtle. But then it goes on, you see. Mahataha param avyaktam, avyaktat purusha paraha. Beyond the great self is the unmanifest. And beyond the unmanifest is what we might call pure spirit, the existent entity. And beyond that spirit, there is nothing. That's the end of the journey. That's the final goal. Why can't we see it? We can only see it in its manifested form. We can see it in its gross aspect, but we cannot see it in its subtle aspect. We may term this the imprisoned splendor. We can understand something that is splendid. We can understand how the sun radiates its light to everything, how the splendor of the sun is responsible for everything else that we call life. So we have some concept of what splendor means. That all the things that have a borrowed splendor from it by themselves are lifeless. That concept we can have. And then it seems to be so subtle that it seems to be imprisoned. There's a wonderful book that was written probably in about 1958 by a physicist, a scientist called Reynold Johnson. And he not only took an interest in physics and science of his day, but he was a professor at a number of universities, studying natural science as well. But he also took an interest in the things we cannot see, in the subtle things, including parapsychology and the paranormal. These are things we can't see, and these are things that in the normal course of science are not really investigated, not seriously anyway. Many, many tests and investigations have been made, but not in this great detail, and no doubt it is a little out of date, 1958. Nevertheless, he evaluates everything fearlessly. And when you're in modern science, you tend to leave these things alone. And he compiles everything in all his research in a book called The Imprisoned Splendour. But he doesn't leave it there. He realizes, like many thinking people, that the very subtle arguments are found in Eastern religion and culture. And so we find him picking many of the ideas from the ancient Vedantic texts, meeting Dr. Radhakrishnan, the former president of India, and so on, a great philosopher, and many others, and getting some glimpses into there to see, are there any satisfactory answers to these paranormal questions, but also, is there any answer to the fundamental questions about life itself? Questions that we are all directly or indirectly concerned with. There are some people who say, I'm not concerned with that. But you're concerned with living. You're concerned with squeezing the maximum pleasure from life. You're concerned with avoiding painful situations. You are concerned with leading your life in a fear-free way. You're concerned with the practical aspects of freedom. Nobody wants to be bound. And so indirectly, whether we know it or not, whether we're fully aware of it or directly aware of it or not, we're all concerned with the fundamental questions of life and driven toward these answers just by our curiosity. Every child is curious about their environment, and we should at least understand where we're living and what life is all about. But we go all through life even with a diluted concern with these questions. But those who follow it in depth, stimulated probably by a level of unhappiness, or when pain acutely comes to us, then we take life a little bit more seriously. Just like in the Mundaka Upanishad, the story of two birds on a tree. And when pain becomes a little bit more acute for the bird going on the lower branches of this tree, tasting the bitter and sweet fruits of life, We are inspired toward a grand ideal, one which is splendid, exhibiting its splendor at the top of the tree. And we would never register it as being imprisoned. But what gives us the concept of it being imprisoned is the level of subtlety that is required to discover it. And so he writes this magnificent book, and in the last chapter, he writes the significance of the whole. Imprisoned, Splendour, Reynold Johnson. And in there, he summarizes many, many things. He writes like this: when the present epoch comes to be assessed in the perspective of history, it seems at least likely that two things will impress the historian: the enormously accelerated rate of scientific discovery and consequent technological advance, and the singular way in which these advances were used for physical destruction. Now we can see this today more than ever, and despite the fact that people are trading internationally, cooperating on pandemics, and all the rest of it, we are still left with the hanging shadow of nuclear warfare that was used so disastrously in the Second World War of the last century. And so nuclear armaments, with a press of a button, can destroy vast populations. And so he's writing this in a time, in 1953, I think it is, and he's registering the potential for our own destruction. This alone leads us to investigate what the subtle areas of life will be. He says we may sum up the physicist's conclusions in a sentence that space, time, and material form, all of which are useful and indeed basic concepts in the large-scale world, are elusive concepts, probably of little value in explaining the microcosm. And the microcosm is a term that shows us that when we look at cosmological things and space and time and its vastness, there is another end of the scale that is more reliable, more tested, and very, very subtle. So subtle we can't trace it or see it, but we know the effects of it. The philosophers, he says, have told us for a long time that space and time are mental conceptions or devices to assist in the correlation of our sense data. And they have told us that as far as the material world is concerned, sense data are the only things of which we are aware, and that the plain man's assumption, which was until recently also the physicist's assumption, that there was something substantial or material out there in space as the cause of the sense data, is unnecessary. This is, in modern times, comparatively speaking, an echo of what we have just studied in the Kathopanishad. That when you go beyond the sense organs, registering the sense organs within the frame of space and time, what will you find? You will find mind. And you'll find that each level that we go through, that this Kathopanishad has been through, is more causal. What not only observes the field in front, but what causes it. It is the mind that causes the sense organs and the sense objects. And it is the intellect that causes the mind. And behind that great intellect, it is the cosmic mind which drives everything. And behind that cause, we find that entity that we call nature. And behind that, we find pure spirit, existence itself, consciousness itself, and infinity. And so this leads us to a wonderful conclusion. Having gone through all of these various aspects, we can see other people's points of view as well. And previously, we have seen in this Kathopanishad the analogy of a chariot as well, and how we can use things functionally, but the owner, and we see this registration, this order, in the analogy of a chariot. The senses are represented by the horses going in different directions. That there is a mind that holds it, an intellect that holds the rein, the reins being the mind, manas, and that there is an entity that sits there in the chariot, by its presence directing everything. The wonderful analogy. Then we come to this beautiful stanza, Esha sarveshu bhuteshu kudotma na prakashati drishyate tvagraya putya sukshmaya sukshma darshibihi. The self. What is the self? The self is that entity that remains when you have removed all the changing fields in front. When you have seen, observed all the layers in a hierarchical order, structured like that. And what remains there is the self inside everything, something like an imprisoned splendor, at its most subtle, beyond which you cannot go, the final datum. So that self, though hidden, we can't see it. It's not the subject to our scrutiny. We cannot test how long it is, how short it is, how vast it is. It has no characteristics like that. It is that entity that is ultimately the seer. And when you address the question of consciousness, it's simply answering a very simple question. And this question is being raked up and explored like a great agricultural field. What is this thing? What is this thing called consciousness? Registered as consciousness is the hard problem. It's only because you're only thinking of it in objective terms, and you're leaving out the whole idea of a subject completely from the science. But it's simply a question. What or who is it that knows anything else? Who is it that knows the objects in front? Who is it that knows the mind? Who is it that knows the intellect? Who is it that knows that everything that proceeds in front? And that final knower is also a witness, a seer. It is a witness, and therefore it is an enjoyer, because it witnesses. Also described in those terms. So it's hidden in all beings. It's not surprising that you stand and say, I am here, but what does everything else mean, and where is God? It's very hidden from you, but it has to be explored. Now, if it's hidden, can it be revealed? So it says like this. It does not shine forth. See, dark matter also doesn't shine forth. Dark energy also doesn't shine forth. There are many things that don't shine forth, that we cannot visibly see. They are not accessible through the sense organs. So it does not shine forth, but it can be seen by those subtle seers. And then there is a sight, an inner sight that can be used. The subtle dimension of the mind can be used. And how is it? Through their sharp and subtle intelligence. We must, in other words, direct a serene and straight look at the divine object. It is samyak darshana that is quite different from things such as occult visions or paranormal visions. So the commentary goes like this. Shankaracharya comments like this. He says, alas, how unfathomable and unscrutable and variegated is this, and he calls the term Maya. That every creature, though in reality identical with the supreme entity, at fundamental level, everybody's identified with that supreme entity. But when we discover that entity, we see it is the only entity, that the apparition of fragmentation is nothing more than an apparition. And the example that can be used is when we look at a skyline in the city and see the jagged shapes, triangles, spires, domes against the sky. Somebody who doesn't know any better will say, how is it that this thing that we call the sky can be cut up into all these shapes? No, it's only your wrong perception. You made a mistake about it. It is infinite. You can't cover up and fragment the infinite. It is in the foreground. And so our illusion of making a superimposition on something is called Maya, derived from the same root that means to measure, something that we measure, and something that is measured requires space and requires time. Supposing you take away space, supposing we make an experiment, I told this a number of times, and you say, all right, prepare yourselves. We are about to remove space. 1, 2, 3. Well, all objects will get removed because in order to register objects, space is required. We need that background. We need to define a separation between this and that. And in order to do that, we require what is called space. Things occupy space. If you take the whole of space away, all the objects have to disappear, inevitably. All right, then we say, okay, let us take time away. Bring space back, let's take time away as a dimension. So we prepare everybody like you're preparing for a photograph. Please put your last comb in your hair, look at yourself in the mirror, and then pose right. You take the photograph that makes time static. And that means there's no change going on. So that means everybody is stuck permanently in a picture. Nothing moves. So when we take space and time away, we've pretty much taken away our familiar universe. But has it taken away everything? No. Space, when you take space away, you take the problem of dividedness away. And you're left with an entity that is undivided. And when you take change away, you're left with something that is unchanging. And you're also left with something that is infinite. When you take smallness away, dimension away, small and large, you're left with something that is infinite. All proportion being taken away, you find infinity. Now, this has been described in the Taittiriya Upanishad in that language, that it is existence, that it is knowledge, and that it is infinity that is put. So this variegation is due to this Maya that leads us to a conclusion that the fragmented universe that we see is nothing more than that same fragmented spirit. But how can you break a spirit up? How can you make parts from the partless? It only appears to be so. And this appearance is called Maya itself. That every creature, though in reality identical with the supreme entity and is instructed as such, does not grasp the fact. What is the fact? I am the Supreme Self. At the fundamental level. We can't say it at a physical level. Sri Ramakrishna warns us that as long as we are identified with the ego, that is with the body and mind, as long as we see our individuality, we cannot declare ourselves to be this Supreme Self. So how do we declare it? In the depths of meditation, we realize it. While even without being told, he accepts as his self the non-selves. That is the aggregate of body and senses. The body and senses are made from parts, all joined together. How many parts? Well, at the cellular level, trillions. Trillions of parts, all with their boundaries. And this again raises up the whole concept of imprisonment. Everything is bounded. When you look out to the far corners of the universe, you're stuck with a horizon, a boundary you can't go beyond. This physical body is a boundary for the individual. And within it, Every cell presents itself with a boundary, with a distinct membrane that separates it from everything else. So this is the nature of an aggregate of the body and the senses. And under the idea, I am the child or the son or the daughter of such a one. Most people will register that. I want to introduce my friend here to you. And how do we introduce a person? Oh, my father is this, my mother is this, I'm the son of so-and-so, this is my occupation. We emphasize as our individuality, not understanding that the real self is spirit, is there. And only one spirit can be there. How many infinities can you have? Only one. Though these, that is, are objects of perception, the body and the senses are objects of perception. We say they perceive, but then we have them as objects of perception. I can understand when my eye is scratchy or when it is clear. I can understand where I have earache or when the ear has no pain whatsoever. I can feel an aberration on the skin. When I have some kind of boil or something on the skin, I can observe it, I can see it. Something is observing it. These are objects of perception. So they're objects of perception to oneself and are hence not myself. And like pots, etc. So truly, it is because of being deluded by this difficulty, this misconception, this misunderstanding, this misinterpretation, making a mistake about existence, and that we call Maya. Deluded by the Maya of the Supreme Being, that every man, every person moves again and again through birth, life, death, making the same mistakes and the same misinterpretations. And then, of course, there is this smriti, this scriptural point. I am not revealed to all, being veiled by my yoga maya, says Sri Krishna in the Bhagavad Gita, chapter 7, 25th verse. That is the illusion born of the congress of three fundamental evolutionary forces that allow us to be deluded. One aspect will be hiding this, making things very subtle. A projection of this will also have a misleading effect because we only see what is projected and that obscures what is actually there. But there is a revealing aspect. There is the promotion of refinement of the mind that is done through not just basic morals and ethics, but mobilizing intense feelings toward the highest levels of compassion and love, nobility of spirit, spirit of generosity, genuine charity. And that comes only because we can see these beings in layers. We can see the physical body and see how it's liable to suffering. Made out of the aggregate of all these materials. The nature of it will be, it'll be subject to vicissitudes and vacillations in nature itself. It itself is an object of nature. And then on the more subtle area, psychological area, we can see how most people are suffering. And the cause of their suffering is the delusional aspect that puts ourselves in an isolated position against, juxtaposed to other people. And then we start complaining. He doesn't like me. He scandalizes against me. He told fibs against me. My whole reputation is ruined. All of these kinds of internal scripts that present us with resentment and reaction, all negative thoughts of anger, all negative thoughts of guilt, all negative thoughts of blaming. All these things are our reaction on the basis that the object can influence me, the eternal, the immortal, and it cannot. So this is what we call Yoga Maya in the Bhagavad Gita, and subject to these play of these various forces characterized as Sattva, Rajas, and Tamas. The capacity to hide what is there, the capacity to project onto something is something like a film show that is projected onto a screen. And then it looks as if the screen itself is moving and animated, and it's not. The screen is pure, it is untarnished, and we project something onto it, and the screen is hidden as a result. And when we stop that film and see it and say, can we see what is the screen? We see it in its pristine nature as a substratum of everything. So a pot, yes, can be distinguished. The example is given. But what is a pot? You ask a pot, who are you? What are you? In a deluded way, it may say, I am a pot. My name is pot. But actually, it is clay. It always was clay. It is clay. It always will be clay. It can be transformed from a pot into something else made from clay. There's no gold and the ring. Gold is the substance, and ring, that's the form. The name and the form is different. So all of this is this substance with name and form fashioned in a different way. And I often give the example that changes its function. The same thing though. So the classical example will be, you take as a sheet of steel, a steel sheet, some 20 meters long, with a certain breadth, let us say 6 meters wide, and you know that its function, you know what its function is not. Its function is not to float in water, it will sink. But when you change its form and its name, when you apply heat and pressure to it, and you curve it, and you join the ends, and then you put a wooden cabin on the top, and so on, it now becomes a change of name, a boat. Its identity being changed, its form being changed, its function also is changed, that is to float in water. So you can see this change, this variation of name and form, but the substance is the same. Still it is steel. You haven't changed it. So we have to get used to this way of thinking and seeing things in order to arrive at the subtle. That doesn't mitigate against our normal view of things. It allows us to shift our attention because we now have a wider scope of understanding. It enables us to be practical on the one side, but elevate the mind on another and get closer to the subtlety of the truth as a result. So this means that for his attainment, something has to be done, and that is viewing the world differently, and we call this discernment. This discernment or discrimination is the method. The discerning person should merge each one of these things mentioned, each one of these various layers. So this discerning entity should go in this way, that the wise person, that is the person who suddenly awakens to the idea that some subtle investigation must be undertaken in a serious way in order to deal with the world of vicissitude and pain. They should restrain yache dvan manasi prajnastat vache jnana atmani. They should restrain speech and mind. We can do tremendous damage with speech, but speech is only an expression of how we think. And every time we think, we're thinking in the framework of internal dialogues or monologues, really. We're talking to ourselves. We're always listening to ourselves. Even when somebody else is talking, we're listening to our formulated answers. So speech is there in the mind. It's always there. And we should restrain in the understanding self. In other words, we're going backwards. We're going into subtler and subtler areas. We are retreating from the outer world, the world of the senses. We're now going into the mind. The mind is now going into the understanding. And the understanding should be restrained or retreated or retracted into that great self. And that should go into the tranquil self. And then, of course, from there we have the famous statement that Swami Vivekananda always uses as a highly universal, motivating statement about your own nature. Utishtata Jagrata Pratnyavaran Dibodhata. Arise, awake. And having attained these great gifts of the human body, having gone through the whole evolutionary process from body to body, and having the advantage, as Shankaracharya puts it in the Viveka Shunamani, of coming out as a man or as a person, having gone through all these various accumulated experiences and arriving at this point in the whole cosmological evolution, not just biological evolution, whole cosmological evolution, from Brahma to a clump of grass, is described as all beings. Understand them. And then, is it easy? No. Sharp as the edge of a razor, hard to cross. You shouldn't take it with a sauntering attitude. Difficult to tread is that path. And I'm not just saying this because to get any credibility, you have to attribute it. From time immemorial, all the great wise people, all the rishis, all the sages declared this. Not me that's just saying it. Everybody is saying it. So having attained the boons, that is, by approaching the best teachers. There was a question before we started this session that what is the importance and significance? Why should we have teachers and systems attuned to our own way, to our own path, selectively for us? Well, because we have come out constitutionally different, we require a different approach, something tailor-made for ourselves. And the follow-up question was, well, should we only listen to those, or should we listen to anybody else? Well, you take on whatever resources you can. Since this is difficult, since this is sharp as the edge of a razor, hard to cross, difficult to tread, is that path. Because it is against our gut, it's against our instinctual way of behaving. It is a complete reversal of attitudes. It is now to do with self-control. It is now to do with going from the outside, not just creating a border and registering. Reality is here at the border of the senses and sense experiences. It is going into subtler and subtler areas. It is going away from the familiar world of survival, of our dimensional restriction, of our genetic dispositions, of survival, of procreation, of breathing, of eating and sleeping, and that's it. And going into the subtle area. And so the way of religion or spirituality is not easy, but we can take it up with an adventurous attitude. We can motivate ourselves by saying, we were asleep, but now we can arise up, we can wake up, we can get up, we can arise, we can awake, and we can continue, and we continue with persistence and determination, not to stop until the goal is reached. Jesus said, strive to enter into the straight gate, for the narrow is the gate and straighten the way that leads to life, and few be they that find it, says Matthew's Gospel. In a city, there are gates where everybody flows through, but then there are narrow gates, and the narrow gates are narrow. You have to form a line to get in there. You require patience to get in there. And don't go through the general gate. The general gate, everybody else goes through. Everybody else is looking for advantage. Everybody else is egocentrically driven, selfish. They go through a common gate. But you need to be more selective. You need to go through the less used gate. There's a whole system of programs, I think, called The Road Less Traveled, the Christian program. But it tells you, you see, take the non-competitive gap and use that. That self, without sound, without touch, without form, undecaying, is likewise without taste. It is eternal, without smell, without beginning, without end, beyond the great abiding, by discerning that one. By discerning that one is freed from the face of death. So in this dialogue, in this Kathopanishad, the instructor, the teacher, that is in the form of death, Yama, was aware of this universal appeal of this teaching and this message. And so this universality is also a verifiable thing if we go through that introspective process, bringing out the gist of all the things that were previously said, this hierarchy of presented objects and fields of objects that we can observe. We're told that the Atman, the self, is present in his irradiating splendor. And it's present where? In every single being. It's not an object, it's a subject, it's a knower. And as the eternal subject, it's ever present. It's an ever present datum of experience. It's a reference point for everything else. And it's not just local construction. It doesn't reveal itself as such and such a thing to one and all. Several conditions are required. We have to purify the mind. And we have to do that systematically. And reading won't do it, and scholarship won't do it. So it is also, when we purify the mind, a matching movement takes place on the other side, which we call grace. And so it's not available necessarily for those who are learned. It's not available for scholarship. That's not the criteria for it, because scholars will fail to understand this Atman. And the key to this world is this word is Gudaha, the subtle, the hidden subtle. Its presence may seem mysterious, but it is a splendor. But it's imprisoned, as it were. In the language of Robert Browning, in the poem Body Text Celsus, it is imprisoned splendor. It's not manifest. And so it's unknown to those people who don't see it, whose minds are not purified, whose buddhi, whose intellect is not ready for the revelation. It's not present on the surface of experience. It's hidden in its depth. We find that earlier we had been told that the teacher and the student of this subject should be of an extraordinary type. And even to hear it, it's not available to many. Those who have heard it, having heard of it, they can't understand it. So the teacher has to be wonderful, talented, and the pupil also has to be wonderful and talented. And wonderful indeed is he who comprehends it, that is taught by a talented preceptor, says the Kathopanishad. So with that, we close this subject, Imprisoned Splendor. Om Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. Peace, peace, peace be unto all.